Hello everyone and welcome to my first video on this channel. And in this video we're going to be going over some anatomical terminology. And we're going to be going throughout these terms. We're going to first start off by defining them, and then we're going to be using examples here on the skeleton. So let's first start with the difference between anterior versus posterior. So anterior just simply means in front. Posterior just simply means behind. Right, so on my skeleton, right, my sternum sits very anterior because it's like in front of everything, versus my vertebral column that my probe is running along here sits very posterior. Okay, why is it posterior? Because it's like behind everything. So one could say that my vertebral column is posterior to my sternum. The next terms we're going to do is medial versus lateral. So again, let's start off by defining them. Medial just refers to closer to the midline of the body. Lateral is just further away from the midline. So the midline of the body is just kind of where my probe's running right here. Right, so again, the sternum is sitting in this medial plane here. Right, so my sternum is a very medial landmark, versus my limbs out here are very lateral because they're further away from that midline. So let's do one more example to reiterate that. Here we have my clavicle. And the point where my probe is pointing toward right there, that is my sternal end, versus over here is going to be my acromion. And we can say my sternal end of my clavicle is going to be more medial because it's closer to the midline of the body, versus my acromion on my clavicle is going to be more lateral because it's further away from that midline. Now let's go over the difference between superior versus inferior. So superior just means above, inferior just means below. So on this piece here now, right, we have the skull here, and the skull sits above the sternum. Therefore, we could say the skull is superior to the sternum right here. And since the sternum is below the skull, the sternum is inferior to the skull. And now let's go into the difference between proximal versus distal. First off, I'm going to define them. Okay, so proximal is closer to the trunk. Distal is further away from the trunk. So what is the trunk? The trunk is just this region that I'm outlining with my probe here, right? So it does not include the limbs or the head. So let's do some examples on the skeleton now. So you could say my shoulder joint is very proximal. Okay, why is it proximal? Because it's very close to the trunk here. Versus the tips of my fingers out here are very distal because they're further away from the trunk. And students will often ask, okay, why can't I use the terms superior and inferior here? And that's because, right now my tips of my fingers might be sitting inferior, but if I hold if you hold your arm up, they can go superior. Right, so that's why whenever we're using terms relating to the limbs, the upper limb or the lower limb, we need to use the words proximal and distal and not superior and inferior. So let's do one more example. So here we have the elbow joint, and the elbow joint is more proximal opposed to the wrist joints down here. Okay, why is that so? It's because it's closer to the trunk versus these wrist joints are further away from the trunk. Right, so in this video we kind of covered all these terms, and hopefully they are clear now.